Well, welcome everyone. It is just 6 o'clock today, so I am going to speak a little bit slowly as we get started here, just to let some people who might be trickling on in to the informational session and hearing tonight to be able to join us. So hopefully you are here to hear about the proposed air permit for Louis Padnos Iron and Metal tonight. We're going to be doing an informational session and a hearing, so it will be a pretty interesting evening, I think, and I will kind of lay out what the groundwork is going to be. But first, just introduce myself here. I'm Jennifer Dixon. I'm going to be moderating the session tonight. And before we get started, I'm going to ask Marianne Dolahanty, who is our Air Quality Division Director and also the decision maker on this permit, to just kind of welcome you all to the meeting tonight. So Marianne, if you want to turn your camera on and unmute yourself, you should be able to go ahead and welcome folks to the meeting as soon as you're ready.
Okay, I think I am unmuted and my
You
video's
are.
going. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time to be with us tonight. You may have heard from your local health department and possibly the state Department of Health and Human Services about the numbers they're seeing with regard to COVID-19. So we're also listening to them, and with the number of cases increasing, we find that it's super important for us to keep communicating the need to stay safe while we continue our mission of protecting our communities and the environment. So while we recognize that it's not an ideal situation, we will continue to hold these types of meetings virtually for the time being. Public participation is a very important part of how we do business, and we definitely value these opportunities to hear from you. So we know that everyone is facing their own challenges at this time, and those challenges are different depending on where you come from. So we encourage everyone to follow the CDC safety guidelines, wear your mask. And again, I really want to say thank you for joining us this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. And at this time, I will now pass it back to Jen, and she'll get the rest of the evening going.
Thanks a lot, Marianne. I appreciate that. And I know we have definitely had quite a few comments on this proposed permit already. And folks have been utilizing some of the other mechanisms we have outside of this hearing tonight to submit those comments. So we greatly appreciate that. And Marianne's right, we definitely want to make sure that you all understand how important these comments are to us and how important this process is to how we do business in the state. So at this time, I'm going to ask the rest of my staff to turn their cameras on. I'm just going to quickly introduce the panelists that we have with us tonight, and they're going to come into play a little bit more as the evening goes on. One of the main people that you're going to be hearing from tonight is Chukwu Oj, and he is the permit engineer, and he wrote this proposed permit for Padnos, and he's going to be talking with you about exactly a little bit about how Air Quality Division itself works, and then what exactly the proposed permit is all about, and sort of laying that groundwork for you as well. You already met Mary Ann, and then we also have Andy Drury. He's in our permit section as well, and him and Chukwu worked really closely on this permit together. I have April Lazaro. She's actually out of our Grand Rapids district office, but she has a great familiarity with the other Padnos facilities in the state. So we wanted to make sure that she was available to answer some questions tonight as well. Brad Maya is our our district supervisor in our Lansing district office. And we also have Mike Deppa. He's our toxicologist that worked on this proposed permit. So he'd be able to answer questions on that. Jim Haywood works in our air modeling unit, so modeling, and we also have Amy Robinson from our air monitoring unit. So those two things are a little bit different. We can answer some questions about those, and we'll be talking to you about those a little bit as the night goes on tonight. We also have Sam Davis, and she is going to be the inspector for this facility as it moves forward. I have Annette Switzer, who is our permit section supervisor. She's just listening in, like Marianne is, to the discussion tonight. And importantly as well, we have Christy Alwyn and Justin Tinker with us. They are with our stormwater unit. So they're going to be available to answer questions once we get to the question and answer part of the night as well. So we've got a great variety of staff for you. Hopefully we'll be able to answer most of your questions. If we can't, we definitely commit to finding someone in our agency who can and get those answers back to you. So folks, except for Chukwu, if you want to leave your camera on, but everyone else can go ahead and turn yours off for now, and I'll prompt you in a little bit to turn those back on. So how the evening is going to work tonight, and this part is pretty important. We're going to do this information session first. And like I had said earlier, this is to lay the groundwork of, what does Air Quality Division do? What is our role in the decision making for this proposed facility to go in? Where does our line kind of start and stop with this whole process? So Chukwu's going to be talking about that. He's going to be talking about the proposed permit. We're going to do a question and answer session once he's finished. So that question and answer session is really going to be an opportunity for you all to ask any questions that you might have to kind of give you clarity on maybe some of the things that Chukwu talked about, questions that you haven't been able to find answers to thus far, and we'll be able to respond back to your questions. Once we get to the hearing part, and this is the important part, once we get to that hearing part, which will be either once you all are done asking us questions or at 7 o'clock, whichever comes first, we'll kind of shift over to this public hearing portion. And during that portion is your opportunity to give us comments on the record. We won't be responding to you at all. So there's not a give and take in this portion. It's simply you putting your comments on the record. The question and answer session, even though we record these meetings, is not necessarily for the record. So if you want to make a comment on the record, please do so during the hearing part. I also want to say, and I mentioned this earlier, we've gotten a lot of comments on this proposed permit already. That's awesome. All of those comments that we've gotten via writing or email or even on our voicemail, those all count as comments on the record, and those will be considered when the decision is made after this is all over. After we get done with the hearing part, we'll talk a little bit about other ways you can make a comment for the record if you don't feel comfortable doing it tonight or you don't feel like you're quite ready to do that. We definitely have time and opportunity for you to do that at a later date. I'll talk a little bit about where you can find other information about this proposed project if you haven't been able to dig as deeply as you would like to, or you just kind of want to see what else is out there. And then we'll talk about who you can contact with further questions on the proposed permit itself. As I had said previously, all your lines are going to be muted during the meeting, and we will be recording this meeting. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. And at that time, we also do transcribe it. So if you have anyone that you know that has English as a second language issues or anything like that, they'll be able to view that there. So another important part, well, how do you ask a question? If you're not used to Zoom, you might not know that. So just use your question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type a question in your question and answer box at any time during the meeting tonight, and we'll get to those, like I said, at the end of Chukwu's presentation. If you really feel strongly either about asking a question verbally or making your comment verbally, you can use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And so again, I will try my best to answer folks in the order you raise your hand, but just please bear with me. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging and I'm on my own tonight moderating. Also, I see that we have a few people that have dialed in. That's great. So if you want to raise your hand to be able to speak, you need to just dial *9 on your phone. That will raise your hand for you, and I'll be able to unmute you so that you can ask your question verbally or make your comment verbally when we get to that section. If I'm calling on you though, and you're on the phone, I just want to let you know that I'll be calling you by the last 4 digits of your phone number. So just make sure you know that. I know I always say this, but with 5 people's lines on my phones, I sometimes forget which one's mine and which one's theirs. So just be aware that that is how we are going to be calling that out. So at this time, Chukwu, I'm going to pass it over to you so you can go ahead and share your screen whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Jen. Alrighty, good evening, everyone. My name is Chukwu Oj, and I am the lead permit engineer for Padnos's proposed shredder at the Howell location. And I'm also one of several AQD staff who were involved in the review. We're going to start with an overview, general overview of the Air Quality Division, or the AQD, and then we will get into the review. So with that said, we all know that pollution comes from various different types of sources, which include big farms, fuel burning vehicles, and various industrial sources. The overall mission of the AQD is to protect public health and the environment, and the AQD has the authority to do so by regulating industrial sources. So the AQD is separated into different functions, and I'll go over them right now. First, AQD staff monitor levels of air pollutants. Other staff look at different toxics to ensure that public health is protected. Then we have other AQD staff who conduct inspections of regulated facilities and ensure that they are complying with our rules and their permit. And then finally, we have other staff who review permit applications and write permits for sources of air pollutants to ensure that operations comply with our rules and regulations. So the Air Quality Division has the authority to permit sources of air pollutants. However, I want to sort of point out that during the review, there are a few items that are not considered, that are not covered, and that the AQD does not have the authority to regulate. And so that includes zoning, noise, and traffic. And if you have any questions or concerns about those issues, it would be great, you would do well to talk to your local government or other agencies that might have jurisdiction over these. So we've had a chance to review some of the comments that you all have provided, and I, like Jen said, I encourage everyone to continue providing comments. I, just wanted to say that we know that there are concerns over traffic, noise, and other issues, but we wanted to say that even if a facility is
Well, I think we might have lost Chuku there for a second. Chuku, we can't hear you or see your screen now, so you might need to reshare that, and I don't know if you can hear me or not. Hopefully you can.
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, we can't see your screen, so you're gonna have to go ahead and reshare. I think we just lost you for a second there.
Okay. Jen, can you see me?
Yep, and you might want to just turn your video off because you might be having a problem with bandwidth, and although we would love to see your face, if it's going to prevent you from being able to tell us what you want to tell us, then it might be a better idea.
Sure. All righty. So I don't know if everyone had a chance to hear me before my video feed cut out, but I kind of wanted to talk briefly about, again, regarding the issuance of a permit. The AQD does, realize that many of the comments are expressing a disapproval of the shredder over issues relating to zoning. But, we just wanted to say that just because a facility gets a permit, obtaining that permit does not trump the facility's requirement to obtain other permits. And by that same token, being granted a permit does not trump local zoning rules. So in Padnos' case, if the AQD issues Padnos a permit, they can't operate the next day. And unless they have received other applicable permits and they have resolved any zoning issues, and if they can't resolve the zoning from the city, then having this permit will not matter for them. So now let's go into the permitting process, and I'd like to give you a simple overview of the steps that the applicant and the AQD will go through to get the proposed permit ready for comment. So first, the applicant will decide what type of equipment they want to install, whether they want to modify any equipment. They'll calculate emissions. They will review any regulations that may apply, and they'll assemble a permit application. Next, the applicant will submit the application to the AQD. Following that, the application is reviewed by the permit engineer and other AQD staff. So we're looking to see if what they're proposing is going to comply with our rules, whether or not they've done the review correctly, have they included everything that they needed to. Next, once the permit is peer reviewed and approved by the supervisor, the proposed draft permit is sent to the company for review, and then it is posted for public comment. And this is where you guys will get a chance to review the permit, review the supporting documentation, provide your comments, and then in between that time, there may be a virtual hearing session, or there will be a public hearing, such as the one you are attending now. As we are receiving comments, we will be reviewing them, and some of the comments that we receive may lead to changes in the permit conditions. After the comments have been reviewed, the AQD will make a decision on the permit. Either the permit is approved without changes, or it is approved with changes, or the AQD may deny the permit. So this now brings us to Padnos and what they are proposing. And as most of you are aware, Padnos is proposing to install a scrap metal shredder for processing automobiles and other scrap metal. The proposed shredder also includes equipment for the separation and removal of waste material from the products being the scrap iron. And since this shredder would be a new source of emissions and no exemptions apply, the shredder will require a permit from the AQD. So while reviewing the proposed project, the AQD looked at a number of rules that will apply specifically to Padnos. And before I continue, I'm just going to throw out some acronyms, which I will define. But if you have any questions or would like to know more, be sure to ask during the Q&A session. So when looking at the Padnos application, we looked at the following state and federal regulations. So one we looked at was Rule 702, or BACT. This stands for Best Available Control Technology, and this would apply to VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. Next, we looked at NACS and PSD increment, which have to do with the national standards for various air pollutants. NACS standing for National Ambient Air Quality Standard, and PSD standing for Prevention of Significant Deterioration. Next, we looked into how Padnos will demonstrate it will comply with our air toxics rules through the air toxics review. And finally, air modeling was performed in support of that review. And at the end of the day, what the AQD wants to know is, will Padnos meet our rules and regulations? So let's start off with Rule 702 BACT. And as part of the permit review, we looked at different ways for Padnos to limit emissions of VOCs, which VOCs mean volatile organic compounds. This rule applies to new and modified equipment. And as I mentioned, look at different ways to limit VOC emissions, whether it's the limiting the amount of material they process, or having an emission limit. All of those were considered to ensure that Padnos will comply with this rule. And what this led to was that Padnos will have to remove materials such as gasoline and oils that will contain VOCs. There's also going to be an annual limit of on what they can process in terms of scrap metal. And it is the combination of these requirements that will ensure that Padnos will comply with this rule. Next, let's talk about the air toxics review. This rule that's required under Rule 225, this applies again to new and modified sources that emit what are referred to in the state of Michigan as air toxics. And when doing the review, we are looking to see if the proposed impacts from those emissions are lower than the state's screening levels for those air toxics. If they are, then the emissions, then what Padnos is proposing will comply with our rules. So following this review, it was determined that impacts from the proposed shredder are below our screening levels, meaning that Padnos, if they are operating the shredder correctly, proper operation, then they will comply with this rule. Now we will move on to PM modeling, which was done to see if particulate emissions would comply with the national standards. And specifically, we looked at PM10 and PM2.5. The modeling itself was done using a computer that shows what the impacts will be from the proposed shredder, and it took into account the source and facility-wide impacts. And as I mentioned, the goal of this review is, can Padnos comply with the national standards for PM and PM 2.5? And what it led to in terms of permit requirements is that Padnos will have to limit the amount of scrap that they will process per day. And in addition, they will have emission limits for PM10 and PM 2.5. Padnos is going to have to track both. And they're going to have to be able to demonstrate that they are below all of their limits. And it's this combination that will ensure that they will comply with the national standards and the increments available for these two pollutants. Moving on, when it comes to mercury emissions, the AQD pays special attention to potential impacts on nearby sources of water. In this case, we looked at mercury deposition. As you all are aware, there is a wetland near the proposed shredder, and then there are, I believe, 2 lakes within a couple of miles of the shredder. So the goal of the review was to determine, was to determine how, what the impacts would be, and how Padnos could limit its impact on those bodies of water. And when we talk about deposition, we're talking about something being added to an area through some path. Like think something being deposited somewhere. And again, for the mercury deposition modeling, a computer model was used to look at potential impacts on nearby sources of water. And so what this led to was requirements for Padnos to remove materials that contain mercury. So, one example would be the mercury switches in automobiles. Padnos would be responsible for removing that and tracking its removal to ensure that it's done. And they will have to provide records of that whenever the AQD asks for it. In addition to that, there is an emission limit for mercury, and they will have to make sure, Padnos will have to make sure that they are below that, limit. And the combination of limits and tracking will ensure that emissions from the shredder will have minimal impact on nearby sources of water. Next, we are going to talk about what many of you might be interested in, and that would be how Padnos will control dust. As you all may know, dust can come from piles on site and from the shredder itself. And for potential sources of dust, the AQD typically includes what is called a fugitive dust plan. And the fugitive dust plan is simply a plan that requires a facility to take the necessary steps to limit dust from being emitted. So for Padnos, this is going to include frequently applying water to storage piles to prevent dust, and as well as fires. Additionally, there are requirements outside of the dust plan that are specific to the shredder. So in this case for Padnos, they are going to have to use water sprays whenever the shredder is operating. The water spray is simply a device that sprays water on the materials being shredded, and this has the effect of sort of trapping the dust and preventing them from being emitted. And again, as with the other requirements, Padnos is going to have to track these activities and demonstrate to the AQD that they are doing it, that they are doing this. Next, let's talk about Padnos' responsibility to ensure the removal of materials, certain materials from scrap metal. So the AQD, in recognition of the potential for nuisances such as odors, dust, as mentioned in the previous slide, and fires, requires operators of shredders to have what is called a materials management plan. And that's simply a plan that requires that the operator of a shredder remove certain types of materials that are known to cause nuisances from the scrap metal before they are shredded. And this is a plan that must be approved by the AQD before the shredder operates. So in the case of Padnos, they will have to remove materials such as gasoline, oils, refrigerants. Additionally, before the metal is shredded, they will have to ensure that there is no asbestos contained within. And as with the as with the other requirements, Padnos will have to track these activities and demonstrate to the AQD whenever they are asked to provide these records that they have the records and that they are doing this properly. So other requirements that are included in the permit but were not mentioned include testing. So they're going to have to test for different pollutants. They will have what is called a shall test, which means that when they begin operating the shredder, they are going to test. And then the AQD at any point in time can request that the facility conduct further testing to verify emissions. And then Padnos will also have to keep records on how much scrap that they process, how much water they use. They'll have to keep track of emission levels. And if this permit is approved, the emission limits in combination with testing and monitoring and record keeping will ensure that Padnos will comply with the rules and regulations. So in summary, the proposed permit underwent review. There are limits on both the materials and emissions. There are going to be a host of requirements which involve testing, monitoring, and record keeping. And it is this combo that will ensure that Padnos complies with the AQD's rules and regulations. And I just want to mention again that even if a permit is approved, it does not trump local zoning or other permitting requirements from other agencies. And lastly, I would like to thank everyone for listening, and I would like you to give us a few minutes while we get ready with the Q&A session.
All right, thanks a lot, Chuku. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen over yours a minute here so we can get ready. And just FYI, I don't see any questions in our question box, and I know that you guys have questions, so please feel free to get some in there for us. At this time, if I can have my panel members turn your cameras back on, at least the folks that are on the screen, Chuku, Sam, April, Jim, Mike, Amy, and Justin. The rest of you, if you want to keep yours off, you can. Just because I know you guys are here primarily to listen in to what we're going to be talking about. So as a reminder, just want to put the screen up again. If you are calling in and you want to ask a question, please feel free to type *9 into your phone. That will raise your hand virtually over here for me so I can see that you are interested in asking a question, or you can type your question in the question and answer box. That's also completely acceptable. All right. So I greatly appreciate everybody's patience on this. I know Chuku was having a little bit of internet issues there, so hopefully folks were able to get most of the information that they wanted to. And we definitely have plenty of time for question and answer. It's only 6:30 at this point. I wanted to let you all know that even though the chat is disabled for you to type back to us, you can pull out of there some information about the facility in and of itself. So if you wanted to review some of the information that Chuku presented this evening regarding the proposed permit or any of the other supporting documentation, that would be available through there. So please feel free to grab that link. I also shared a link on there that we used to always use when we did our actual in-person meetings, which is a card that's called Public Hearings, What You Should Know. And it basically lays out, what sort of comments are really valuable and can definitely make changes in permit actions like this, and what ones, like Chuku had kind of talked about earlier, like zoning and noise and things like that, that are handled more on a local level that we probably can't change anything in the permit, but just things that you might want to know. So we did have a great question come in, and this is going to be going to you, Chuku, first. At least I want you to speak about what is in the proposed permit about this. And the question is, Measurements record keeping is dependent on Padnos. So, and it says, will there be regular monitoring or tracking by Air Quality Division? So I know Chuku, you talked a little bit about what is in the permit, what sort of record keeping requirements they have. So if you could just kind of paraphrase those a little bit. And then April, I'm going to have Chuku pass it over to you so you can kind of talk about what, as an inspector, we might look for when we are going out to do an inspection or asking for record keeping from a facility like Padnos.
Okay, so with regards to with the monitoring and record keeping, as I mentioned in the presentation, Padnos will have to do tracking both on a daily and then an annual basis. So what's going to happen is with their daily limits, they essentially have to have a record, each day that they're operating, that they processed this much scrap. This is what was likely emitted. And then for the annual tracking, they will have to, it's typically broken down on a monthly basis. So by a certain time period each month, they have to have a record of the amount of scrap that they processed during that month, and then what was likely emitted in that month. With regards to monitoring and tracking by the AQD, what generally happens is that an inspector will be responsible for going out to the site. And my colleague April is going to speak on this in a little bit, but when they're on site, they're going to be checking for those records, and they are going to, if Padnos does not have proper records, there may be compliance implications for that. And in addition to inspections, I do believe that the inspector can ask at any time for Padnos to provide that information.
Yep, that's absolutely right. So April, if you want to just talk a little bit more about kind of how you would go about doing that. And I know Sam will do the same things, but I know you have a little bit more experience in inspecting Padnos facilities than she does at this point.
Sure. One of the things that I like about the AQD as a group is that when we see facilities, especially like this, where we know that there's been public interest and they receive a new permit and they build their facility, we like to get out there and do an inspection within the first year of operation. And we do that for a number of reasons, but really primarily why we do that is that we can make sure that the facility is on track for compliance, that they're keeping all of the records that their permit requires, and that between the facility and the agency, that we have an understanding of what the exact expectations are of them. As you could have seen probably when you looked at the permit, it's pretty complicated and there's many pages and facets to it. So if we make sure that we do an inspection within the initial phases of operation, we know that everyone's on the same page. And specifically with operations that I've seen at Padnos, the equipment is actually equipped with devices that measure the amount of material that goes through the shredder based on the weight in tons. And so it's equipped to do that. And so there's not a lot of human error, so to speak, that's based on weight and measurements. And so it's easier for us to rely on the data that they acquire that way, because we recognize that they're doing it for other purposes in addition to complying with their permit.
Yeah, that's a really good point, April. It is a lot about checks and balances from an inspection standpoint. And when we do inspections on facilities like this, especially when they're new, we definitely look at every single detail of the permit. And oftentimes the inspector will take the actual permit out with them, make sure that every single condition is being complied with. So it's a really big part of our job, and it's really important to us. And we're not doing our due diligence if we're not doing that. So the next question that we got in is a really good one as well. And it says, at what point do the comments made on the permit get published? So how this process works is we take all the public comment in. The public comment period ends on November 23rd. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the evening. But after the public comment ends, the decision maker and all the staff that you see here basically look at all of those comments that we received. we write up a document called a response to comments document, and that's exactly what it is. We take all the comments, we consider them in regard to the proposed permits. The decision maker will decide if there should be changes to the proposed permit and that the permit should be issued, if it should be issued as it is, or if the permit should be denied. And at that point, once that decision is made, then we do publish that response to comments document along with any permit that may be issued. And we will identify and communicate with everybody who participated in this meeting or anybody who was part of the initial interested parties list, what that decision was and all the information that went into that decision. So that would include that response to comment document and all the comments that were made on that. So that's a really, really good question. I just want to check and make sure that nobody has their hand up in case I've missed anybody. And we don't have any other questions in our question box. So I want to give you guys some time to get any other questions in. I'm very good at dilly-dallying, as I will be able to prove here in a couple minutes. And I think my children sometimes have figured out how to do that as well, especially when it comes to bedtime. And I'm saying, hurry up and go to bed. And they got to think of every single thing they can do to not do that in a timely manner. So just want to make sure that you guys have every opportunity to ask any questions that you have. And not to say that there won't be opportunities to ask questions after the hearing is over. The staff that you see in front of you tonight is definitely available for any one-on-one emails or conversations as well. All right. Okay, so see how peer pressure works. We got another question. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, so this question, let me see who is going to be best to answer this one. So the question is, how will Padnos track emissions? So April, I think I'm going to send this to you, and if you can speak from your experience of how this has happened in some of their other facilities in the past, I think that that would be helpful. And then if anyone else has anything that they want to add on to that answer, then we can open it up there.
Well, one of the most important things that I noted Chuku pointed out in relation to this question is that Padnos will actually be conducting stack testing. And so I think to answer the question, I'll go into a little bit about what stack testing is and how it relates to tracking emissions. So during stack testing, the Padnos would be required to hire an outside contractor to come in to perform testing, which would be conducted through a probe that they stick into the stack. And that probe actually captures and measures emissions. And some of those emissions get captured on a filter and then are taken back to the lab and analyzed. And so an example of those pollutants that would be sampled that way would be the particulate matter. And I saw in the permit that we're requiring that they measure the amount of total particulate matter, PM10, which is particulate matter 10 microns or less, and PM2.5, which is the smallest and most respirable particulate matter at the 2.5 micron level. And so while they're doing those samples, they're also monitoring the amount of product and the type of product that is being shredded in the equipment. And that's important because we want the testing to occur during the most representative and highest level of production that the facility can accommodate. And that's important because we feel that at that rate is where we're going to see the highest amount of emissions. And that's going to be representative of the actual operations. And so while they're testing and they're recording that data and information, we will use that during our inspections to make sure that Padnos doesn't go beyond that level of production to a place where we don't know what emissions might be. So the amount of production that occurs during testing and the types of products that they will be shredding during the testing is monitored so that we can make sure that going forward, we know what's going on and what's coming out of that stack.
Thanks a lot, April. I appreciate that. And I think that was a really good answer. I know a lot of people don't really understand what stack testing is. We hear that and it's kind of like, that seems like something a little bit foreign. This was a really good question as well. And the question was, how many inspectors are on staff and how many facilities do they cover statewide? So the crux of the matter is how often would inspections be done? So Air Quality Division has about, and Marianne's on, so she'll correct me if I'm wrong, but about 60 inspectors statewide. In this case, what we do is we have what we call district offices, and they're kind of spread out around the state. We've got 10 different ones. So the one who handles this facility is our Lansing district office, and that's where Sam and Brad are housed. Now, we're obviously coming to you from all of our homes at this point, but they are still doing inspections and responding to those things despite working from home. So the way it kind of works is we might be by geographic area. Inspectors are assigned a certain amount of inspections every year at a certain amount of facilities. They also do what we call self-initiated inspections, which means things where they, like this one, where they might think they need to check in a little bit more often, like April mentioned, because it's a newer facility and we want to make sure that the facility starts off on track and we want to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Inspections are also triggered by complaints. So if, for instance, you are in the area of this facility and you are observing that dust might be impacting you, or you're getting odors or things like that, you can always give us a call, and Sam would be very responsive to getting out to the site to either do a complaint investigation or do an inspection at that time. So Brad, I saw you to your camera on, so I appreciate that. Hopefully you're going to speak a little bit maybe about how many inspectors you have on staff and kind of how that work is divvied up in your district. But you got to unmute yourself. Don't forget to do that.
Okay.
There you go.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. I can elaborate a little bit on what you said there. So we have 6 inspectors in the Lansing district. And at any one time, any one of them could respond to a call in Livingston County. But Sam Davis does have the primary responsibility for this area and any potential sites that will be constructed there. Pretty much what you said, Jen. I just wanted to elaborate one thing. In addition to all those ways that we could be out there and getting complaints, hearing from citizens, we also have a lot of staff and other divisions that would be driving through the area, possibly even inspecting the facility for other reasons. So they would relay information to us. We share a lot of information across divisions within Eagle. So that's a great thing about our organization. And see, the other point that I wanted to mention is that we do drive-bys quite frequently. Sam would be inspecting other facilities in the area, and she would be able to drive by that facility quite often and do visible emission checks and make sure she's not seeing anything. We do plan on having a strong presence in the area, and we always strive to do that. So, and we're always available for complaints, and it's hard to put an exact number on the times we will be out there, but it's quite often.
Thanks a lot, Brad. I appreciate the greater amount of information. And I think emphasizing the fact that, you know, Eagle, we are a team here. That's why we have Justin and Christy on with us tonight. We definitely look out for each other. And whenever one division notices something, we pass that word on. I mean, that's also a big part of our job as well. All right, this is a great question. So Chuku, this is going to go to you. So the question is, what about other sources on site for PM10 emissions? So for example, are conveyors required to be covered? What about loading and unloading operations and on-site traffic? And then there's a second part to that, but I'll let you address the PM10 other issues and covering of conveyors potentially first.
Sure. So I think what I will have to do is I will have to get back to you specifically on the covering of conveyors and loading and unloading. But I can say in general that the fugitive dust plan sort of covers that portion, as they're supposed to take the steps, reasonable steps, to ensure that fugitive dust is not leaving from the site. So that, you know, that will include conveyors, That will include loading and unloading and traffic. And then specifically with the permit, there is a limit on opacity that that is for the conveyors, and the opacity, if we can sort of go to that, bring up that bonus slide. It's sort of a kind of a measure of how cloudy the smoke is, so to speak. And if you could see a lot of smoke, there's a huge problem with concerns to opacity. And Padnos's permit has a very, very stringent limit on opacity. And Padnos staying below that limit will limit the emissions of PM10 from those operations.
Okay, so this is this second part of this question is going to go to you, Amy. So the question is about air monitors, and the question is, can you require them to put air monitors along the property boundaries? So that's not part of the permit at this point at all, but I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the air monitors that are in the area around the facility and what we're looking for there.
So generally, we are required to put in air monitoring locations based on population. So because of the population status, Livingston County is in the Detroit census, greater census area. And the number of monitors in the region is based on that entire population. And we strive to set them up according to population centers and industry that is in the area. So we can't cover the whole, put a monitor everywhere. The goal of our monitoring sites are to track long-term trends of different pollutants in the environment and be able to check that over time. We don't do site-specific monitoring in the air monitoring unit. It is more regionally based monitoring that covers larger areas.
So that being said, we do sort of do that. And Jim, you know this one's coming to you because this is where the air modeling comes into play. So although we're not requiring the facility to do an air monitor on their property boundaries, and that's not really something that we have an easy time requiring because it's hard for us to do with the rules that we have in place right now. But part of the review that we did was what was called an air model. And I'm going to let Jim talk about it a minute. You guys are going to see me like unshare my screen, and then I'm going to share my screen with the receptor grid, we call it. It's a very fancy word for basically like putting fake computer models, monitors all over the area. So I'm going to pull that up for you, Jim, while you go ahead and talk to folks about that.
Okay. Well, briefly, before Chukwu can pass off on this, he has to be assured that this project is not going to cause or contribute to any air quality violations. Now, ideally, what you would do is put a monitor out there and actually measure the air and determine whether or not it violates any of the health standards. Well, since we can't do that before the project is built, we have to do it in more of a predictive manner, and that's where the model comes into a play. Just to give you a brief overview of the model, we get this from EPA. They spent many years developing this model. They go out and they actually do testing of the monitor and the model together to see how well it does. And if anything, these models tend to be very conservative. They do tend to overpredict a little bit, and that is by design, because if you're going to make a mistake, you want to err on the side of caution. So what we do is basically we build this facility inside of the computer model. We put buildings in there, we put the stacks in there. If necessary for some of the projects, not so much for the air toxics, but we will include other facilities in the area. And the model will take that and it will take those numbers. And what we want to know is once that air leaves the property, what is the public exposure going to be? Now, as you look at the picture that's on there, especially the blow up there where it says proposed location, you will notice that we don't have any of those little hatch marks inside the property. That's because our jurisdiction only covers what we call ambient air, and that is the air to which the public has reasonable access to. When it comes to employee exposure, then that falls under one of the OSHA groups out there, and they deal with the employee exposure and whether or not there's any risk there. So our responsibility shows up right there at the property boundary. So we build a network of, like Jen said, we call those, each one of those little hatch marks a receptor, but basically if you want to think of it as a virtual monitor, that's what it is, a predictive monitor. And we want to calculate in a predictive way, what is the maximum impact going to be at each one of those virtual monitors once the company emits theoretically in its maximum amount that's allowed by the permit. And as you can see underneath the blow up, that field is quite extensive. And literally we have one of those virtual monitors at everybody's backyards, on the schools, hospitals, you name it. They're not very far apart. Closer in, we expect the plume to be thicker, so we put those virtual monitors closer together, typically about 75 feet apart. So it's got a good coverage there. At the end of the day, what we're looking for is where the computer is going to predict the maximum impact and what that maximum impact is going to be. Again, this is assuming that the facility is operating at its allowed limit all the time. And we identified that one virtual monitor out of those, and I think there was like 21,000 of those in this particular grid. There was a lot of them out there. We want to identify the one that is the maximum impact, the maximum exposure, and that's our go-to number to compare against all the various health thresholds out there. And before I can go back to Chuku and say this passes the modeling, that maximum impact has to be below each and every applicable threshold for our health standard. And that's pretty much the long and the short of it. If it doesn't pass, then I've got to go back to Chuku and say, look, the modeling is failing here. It's showing that it is a violation of one of the health standards out there. And then he has to go back to the company and they have to look at different scenarios, different alternatives, different ways to get that ambient air impact lower so that it comes in below that or all the thresholds out there for health quality. So that's pretty much the long and the short of my world in modeling.
Thanks a lot, Jim. I appreciate that. It's always my favorite topic, and I get really excited when people bring up air modeling because I think that this is such a big part of our review that people don't necessarily understand. And of course, we all would love to have an air monitor in our backyard to really tell us everything that's going on. But this computer model does that and so much more, and it really looks at exactly what folks want to know. But it does it beforehand, so we know even before things happen what it could be. And that I think is even more important. So this asker asked a lot of really good questions and we're gonna tackle them all right now. So this one is gonna go to you, Mike Deppa. And the last question on this list says also, were there any other air toxics considered? So if you can talk a little bit about the air toxics review that went into this permit, proposed permit, I would really appreciate that.
Thanks, Jen. Yes, there were, as you would expect, a number of metals that are emitted by this facility. So we looked at chromium, manganese, nickel, and those are the chemicals that we derived health-based screening levels for, and that Jim talked about. We compare the maximum predicted ambient impact at one of those receptors, the highest one. If it's below the health-based screening levels for those chemicals, then we know that public health is being protected.
Sorry, that was my bad. My computer went a little wacky there. It started pouring rain here. I'm sorry, I'm on the west side of the state here in Lowell, and it just started downpouring and things went wacky over here a little bit. So that's a great tie-in though, Mike, to one of these other questions that kind of lead into that. And you're probably not going to be the best one necessarily to answer this. This is probably going to go to Chukwu, but it does have to do with the review that we did. So the question is, lead and hexchrome have been included in past shredder permits. Is there a reason we wouldn't be stack testing for that, or a reason they wouldn't be included in the Padnos permit? So Chukwu, can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. So I'm going to start that. I would like to get back to the ASCII regarding regarding lead, but I can speak directly to hexavalent chromium right now. I do believe that there is a limit, an emission limit in the permit, but it is a facility-wide limit as opposed to a limit specifically to the shredder. I would have to get back to you as to your question regarding them being addressed, but there is a hexavalent chromium limit, and that was based on the review performed. So that is.
Oh, sorry, Chukwu. I was just going to tell you that the asker did provide their name, and we should have their email, so you'll be able to respond back to them after the meeting is over.
Okay.
So those are really, really good questions. Just kind of going through this, I wanted to check my time and make sure we've got a few more minutes here before we need to start the hearing portion. All right. So this is an interesting question too. So April, I'm going to send this one to you first and see if you can kind of speak to it. And then if you can't answer it directly, we might be able to either get a more specific answer after the meeting's over, because I'm not sure that we actually looked into numerating this, I guess, is what I would say to this one. So the question is, how many Padnos facilities are in Michigan and what is their compliance status? So at least from an air quality standpoint, I think you might have looked at that. So if you want to speak to that briefly, that would be great.
I can speak briefly about some of that because I don't know the exact number in the state. I'm familiar personally with 3. There are 2 shredders in the Grand Rapids district, which is where I'm housed. And then I believe there's also another one in the Lansing district. I'm looking for a nodding of head from some of my Lansing folks to confirm that. Okay. And so from my perspective, I've most recently done an inspection at the Grand Rapids facility, and the compliance status there was that they were in compliance at that time.
Okay, thank you. So just to mention briefly related to that, any Padnos facility that does have a permit with us or is inspected by us on a regular basis, we do have that information posted online. So if you wanted to go online to michigan.gov/air, you would just look for facility specific information, and that would lead you to a page where you could do a search for different facilities, at least from an air quality standpoint, and kind of look at a little bit more holistically, depending on what your actual goal is for using that information. All right, so we have a time for probably one more question here, and I apologize we're not going to get to all of them, but I appreciate you guys sending questions in. When we don't have questions, I always wonder, I know we didn't tell you everything that you wanted to know, so we really appreciate that. And this question is going to go to you, Chukwu, and the question has to do with the hood that is mentioned in the proposed permit, and it says, does Padnos know the capture efficiency of the hood/stack? Shouldn't they test for that in the stack test to determine if the stack test represents all of the emissions of concern?
Sure. So I think in answering that question, we're going to talk a little bit about opacity, because typically in these reviews for the shredder, most of them are going to install an exhaust hood, and it's very important that all of the emissions, as much as possible, are being directed through the hood and exhausted through the stack. And so we've sort of determined that what's referred to as good capture, where you're gonna get all the emissions through the hood, is correlated with an opacity of 10%. So going back to opacity, I said it was something that, if you can see smoke and it's really, really built, if you can see smoke and it's really, really clear that it's smoke, that's a huge problem. But 10% opacity is something that you can barely see with the naked eye. And it's also a more stringent limit than what is typically allowed within our rules. So Padnos is proposing in their application, and their permit will have a opacity limit of 10%. And Padnos will have to demonstrate that they are meeting that limit. And when the inspector goes on site, one of the things that they'll be checking for likely is to see if there is any smoke coming, any smoke that is not being directed to the hood.
So yeah, opacity is kind of one of those complicated things. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to that slide really quickly. My computer is being kind of a bugger right now. But I think Chuku is absolutely right. 10% opacity is a very, very tiny amount of dust or smoke. It is hardly visible to the naked eye. Just as a kind of a caveat to that, all of our inspectors are required to be certified to read opacity twice a year. And we go to this kind of crazy class where they show us different levels of smoke, and you have to train your eye to be able to read that. It's a very specific and prescribed way. So that's definitely something that Sam would be doing if she had any concerns that they were not meeting that more stringent limit. Typically 20% is kind of like a general condition that all companies have to meet opacity limits, to be limiting those particulates, those fine particulates. But 10% is more stringent than normal. And so it's definitely something that Sam will be looking at if this permit is approved and the shredder is actually installed. So that being said, we didn't get to all the questions that you all had. You guys had great questions. We'll try to get to some of these directly if you provided your email address. If you did ask your question anonymously, but you would like a response back directly, please go ahead and just supply that in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to address those for you. So we're going to shift over to the hearing portion of the night. So thank you so much, panelists, for all your answers and your participation. Greatly appreciate that. You guys can go ahead and leave your cameras off, except for Mary Ann, because she's going to be participating with us in the hearing portion tonight. So shifting gears, just remember that once we get to the hearing portion, this is the part where we won't be necessarily responding back to you once you make your comment. I just want to remind you, there's a few ways that you can make a comment tonight. You can type your comment into the question and answer box, and I will read your comment out loud unless you say do not read. And we'll kind of go over this. I have to read sort of a boring hearing statement to you to officially open the hearing up in just a minute. If you are calling in or you really feel strongly about speaking your comment aloud, we have no problems doing that. Just either raise your hand using the icon at the bottom of your screen or type *9 into your phone. Okay, so this is our public hearing portion, and I apologize. I just realized that the wrong decision maker is still on this slide. It should say Mary Ann Dolahanty, Air Quality Division Director. So not Chris Etheridge. I apologize for that. So what I'm going to do now is read a opening statement for the hearing. Once we're done with that, if you would like to make a comment, like I said, please feel free to start typing that in the question box or raise your hand. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this public hearing. My name is Jennifer Dixon, and I am with the Environmental Support Division of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or EGLE, and I will be the hearing officer tonight. We have Mary Ann Dolahanty, Air Quality Division Director, and she is the decision maker for this permit, and she will be listening in on the hearing this evening. This hearing is for a proposed permit to install for the installation and operation of a new scrap metal shredder and associated processes at Louis Padnos Iron and Metal, hereinafter Padnos, located in Howell, Michigan. I have some background information to share before we begin. The Air Quality Division is responsible for regulating sources of air pollutants to minimize adverse impact on public health and the environment. The law governing those responsibilities is Part 55 of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. Before Padnos can install the proposed scrap metal shredder and associated processes, they must obtain a permit that meets the requirements of Michigan's air quality laws. This means that the plant must be capable of meeting state and federal emission standards, including health-based standards. The proposed permit must also contain conditions that include emission limits and specific ways of operating the equipment to ensure these standards are met. The purpose of tonight's hearing is to give anyone interested in the proposed scrap metal shredder an opportunity to provide information the department may use in deciding whether to approve the permit to install, or if there are additional issues to consider. Please note the proposed permit to install is still a draft permit. This does not mean the department has already made a decision. Instead, it reflects an initial technical review of the proposal. We hope having the details of the draft permit available will help you in providing comments. Everything in the draft permit remains open for comment and further consideration by the department, including whether the permit will be granted at all. Please recognize the department can only use the information you provide if it relates to the criteria the department must use in making a decision. For example, concerns related to local zoning, truck traffic, and noise are not within the department's authority. Some of you may want to simply express your support or opposition to the proposed project. We'll be happy to make note of your position, but please understand the department is, by law, not allowed to base our decision on whether there is widespread support or opposition to the proposed project. The hearing is being recorded, and your comments will be part of the information the department will consider in making its decision on the proposed shredder. The public comment period for the proposed shredder is started on October 9th, 2020, and will end at midnight on November 23rd, 2020. Additional information may be submitted through that time. After the close of the public comment period, the decision maker will review all written and verbal comments received. All significant air quality related comments will be considered, at which point a final decision on the proposed permit will be made by the decision maker. As a reminder, the decision maker may deny the permit, approve as drafted, or approve with amendments. If approved, the decision must specify which provisions of the draft permit, if any, have been changed in the final permit and the reasons for the change. In all three scenarios, all interested parties, including everyone who was on the original mailing list, anyone who provided comments during the public comment period, and anyone who attended the public hearing will be directly notified of the decision. Included in the mailing will be a letter from the decision maker regarding the decision and, if applicable, the approved permit. As stated previously, you may submit a written comment at any time to the email address that we will provide. You may also type the word comment into the question box and submit your comment. I will read aloud all comments you submit via the question box unless you just state do not read. If you would like to make a verbal comment, you may raise your hand and I will unmute your line so you can speak. Please state your name and we will limit your comment time to 3 minutes. If you are speaking, I will let you know when you have approximately 30 seconds left. I will do my best to address commenters in the order your hands were raised, but please bear with us as the technology does have challenges with doing that. Please recognize department staff are here tonight to provide a fair opportunity for you to express your views on the proposed automotive shredder and to listen to those comments. Thank you for your attention. I will now begin calling the names of those who have indicated they would like to make a statement. Okay. Give you guys a second to let me know that you would like to make a comment. And don't forget, you can use the hand icon on the bottom of your screen, or you can click *9 on your phone if you are calling in and would like to make a comment. Give you guys a couple minutes to ponder that or to finish typing your comment. And I know sometimes that can take a little bit. I don't want to prematurely cut anyone off, but I don't see anyone typing comments in at this point or raising their hand. So I'll give you guys another couple minutes, no pressure. We do have a couple other things to go over after we close the official comment period for the hearing tonight. As a reminder, the comment period does stay open until November 23rd, so you have plenty of time to still make a comment if you choose to not do so tonight, but you would still like to do that. Okay, well, I don't see any comments coming in. So Marianne, with your nod, I'm going to go ahead and close the comment period. Okay. All right, I have to read a closing statement, and then we do have, like I said, a couple other things that we need to go over here. So the closing statement says, thank you for taking time to participate in this meeting tonight. We do appreciate your interest in protecting Michigan's air quality. As indicated at the beginning of the hearing, the public comment period will close at midnight on November 23rd, 2020. All interested parties, anyone who provided comments during the public comment period, and anyone who attended this public hearing will be directly notified of the final decision on this proposed permit. The hearing is now closed. Thank you again. Okay, so with the hearing being closed, I see that folks have just asked a couple questions that I want to address really briefly here. And that is, when is the decision going to be made? How, what is the timing on these things typically? So we don't have a time frame necessarily. The public comment period doesn't close until November 23rd. So at that time is when we'll start looking at all of the comments, and Marianne will, and the staff that you see in front of you will begin making a decision on that. It's not necessarily a fast and easy process. These things take time, and it does depend on the content of those comments and whether or not we are going to be considering changes to their proposed permit, or a denial of the permit for sure is something that we weigh heavily. So that being said, I know folks probably would like to know exactly when that's going to happen, but I don't have a good answer for you on that one, and I apologize. But like I said, you will be notified of that decision when it happens. So that being said, if you are calling in and you would like to be notified and you're not sure if you're on the mailing list, please feel free to send a note to the email address here, and I will read that out loud for folks that are on the line. Or we also have a voicemail that we take comments on verbally, and I'll go over that in a second as well. If you would just like to be notified of the decision and you don't have an email address, or you don't really want to provide one, or you would like to provide a mailing address, we can also send you information that way. You can feel free to call that voicemail box and leave your information. So after the meeting tonight, if you would like to make an official comment, like I said, we have various ways of doing that. And one of them is by actual mail. We do have folks going into the office to get mail. So if you'd like to send a comment, you're going to send that into Annette Switzer, and she is our permit section manager. And I'm going to just read this address kind of slowly for you in case anyone would like to jot it down that's on the phone. So again, that's Annette Switzer, permit section manager at Eagle Air Quality Division. And the address is P.O. Box 30260, Lansing, Michigan. And the zip code for that is 48909-7760. If you would like to email a comment, that's definitely a great way to get us your information. And that email address, and I'll do it annoyingly slowly as well here, but that email address is eagle-aqd-pti public comments, and PTI public comments is all one word, at michigan.gov. So that's eagle, EGLE-AQD P as in Paul, T as in Tom, I as in igloo, the word public, and then the word comments, all one word, at michigan.gov. That phone number that you can call if you'd like to leave us a comment on voicemail, or you just want to leave an email address for us to be able to contact you easily once the decision is made, is area code 517-284-0900. So where can you find other information? So I did share this in the chat, but I know we have a couple of folks calling in, so I'm just going to kind of verbally tell you how to get there. And what you can find there is the actual public notice that went out, the